Let's see if I can have everybody see this. Hello, everybody. And if I've got this right, Raj, how do we look? And can you see everybody? Can you see the screen okay?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. So, as Raj said, we're going to do the top 10 reasons why projects fail. Jim Stewart, JP Stewart Associates. I teach and I consult. And I've been doing this for about 20 years, and a lot of my background happened to be in IT, some in pharmaceutical, some in financial. And over the years, I've made my observations about why projects fail. But interestingly, when I started doing this presentation a couple of years ago or so, in the intervening time, I've sort of put together a couple of different presentations. And recently I discovered a survey that talked about why projects fail. It wasn't about why projects fail, it was about recovering when they do fail. And that survey had its own list of reasons why projects fail. And it dovetailed nicely with my list. So I put them together in the top 10, and I'm going to go through those and we'll talk about them. And what I'm going to do along the way is I'm going to entertain questions at the end. So if you have questions, you can chat them to me, and I will read them off and entertain them at the end of this session. But what Raj has asked me to do is to make it somewhat interactive. As we go along, I'm going to present reasons why projects fail, and I'm going to ask you in some cases for possible solutions. You can chat me those solutions, and I will read them out and give you my answer. I'll reveal my answer. So that's the idea, top 10 reasons why projects fail. And let's see why we care. Let's see if I can move that forward. There we go. So we're going to learn to recognize the 10 project failure signs in the organization. That's going to be what's failing in your organization. And by the way, Raj, Raj, do you see my chat as well? Can you see the chat, or is it just me?
Well, I can't see your chat. You can share your screen. I can see your screen. So you can go ahead with the topic.
Okay. In case I get chats about my answers, I sometimes see it, sometimes don't. We'll get back to that. We'll discover some possible solutions for each problem. We'll talk about that. And we'll understand what commonly used solution is not necessarily a solution at all. I'll save that one for near the end. Okay? So we'll talk about that. Now here's the survey I was talking about. This survey, if you look at the bottom, was done by a company called PC Solutions, a US-based company with a lot of senior Project Management Institute fellows and whatnot. And the idea behind the survey was recovering projects. But if you think about it, there has to be a reason that you're recovering projects. Obviously, something has gone wrong and they're trying to pull them back. So the good news about the report is that there are ways to recover it. But let's talk first about the bad news that I found and how we found it. So they had these respondents, a lot of C-level people, VPs, directors, head of the project management office, project managers, good number of large organizations, professional and technical services, manufacturing, IT, pretty much across the board. So a combination here of a number of very typical companies along with very senior management about what happens in their projects, in their companies, when projects fail. So I'm going to save the last bullet for revealing it because it may surprise you. According to this report, firms manage $200 million in projects each year. This is about a 2-year-old report. During that time, they'll realize that 74 million, almost 40% of the projects are at risk of failing. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and I always look at these project failure numbers hoping they'll come down. And in the past 10 years, it's always hovering around 37, 40% failure, somewhere 35 to 40% failure. So it hasn't changed that much. Now, the point is, you can recover projects given senior management's willingness and the right PM, project manager, right? So you need that combination of that senior management's willingness and the right processes. Those who had a standard project management methodology had fewer than half as many project failures. Almost organizations, we might as well say all because it's 92%, rated the skill and knowledge of the project manager very important or important to the success of the recovery. Here's the thing I'm going to reveal that may somewhat surprise you. According to the survey, despite all that, the average dollars lost due to project failures per firm is a staggering, I added the word staggering, 24 million per year. Some of these projects are huge, whether the government projects or pharmaceutical projects or whatever. Companies in the aggregate lose a lot of money every year on projects. The Project Management Institute doesn't have this exact number, but they have a very similar number that I happen to see today in a survey. So there is quite a bit at risk there, and there's a reason to figure out why these projects are failing. That's why. So if you want to know why we're having this talk, what problem are we trying to solve? This is the problem we're trying to solve, because that number of 40%, even though it stayed more or less the same over the years, I think there's an acceptance that, well, that's just the way it is. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. It can be made better. Many reasons that projects fail. As I mentioned up front, I've been speaking for a while. This report dovetails. I've highlighted the top 5, but I'm also going to talk about, my 5 as well. I'll ask you for some possible solutions, and we'll talk about those. Okay. Reason number 1, requirements. Now, requirements are those things, this is going to sound dumb, but that your product or service requires. If I'm making a laptop, it has to be certain color, it has to have a keyboard, it has to have wireless, it has to have mean time between failure for the hard drive. If I'm making a drug, it has certain requirements. If a financial instrument, we call it, has certain requirements. The problem is requirements are very often ambiguous, unclear, and not prioritized. And so the problem is, yeah, I want this laptop, I want this battleship, I want whatever, but it isn't well laid out in the cases where it's not well done. And there's ways of doing it. I was just reviewing something. It's not part of this, a little bit ahead of it, but they have a thing called quality function deployment where they use a process or a tool called the House of Quality, and they figure out what are the voice of the customer, how does that translate into technical design, and then they also figure out, competitively, our competitors with that and how they will design the actual thing. The problem here is it takes a while to do this, to collect these and understand how it's done. Now, it may not be the project manager's job. It could be the business analyst's job to do it and put them over to the project manager, but somehow the project manager is supposed to get the right requirements and make the right thing. Agile, that you may know of, and we're a little bit out of scope for us, was designed in part to deal with ever-changing requirements. So you have these sprints, which are 2 to 4 weeks long, allowing the product owner, think sponsor, to change her mind or tweak the potentially shippable product. So at the end of 3 or 4 weeks, she might say, well, that's nice. I gave you requirements, but now at the end of 4 weeks, I have a better idea. Let's do this instead. So one of the things that Agile tries to solve is these ever-changing requirements. So I think, and I'll reveal this first one answer, and I'll ask you in subsequent ones for your answer. Solution here is pretty straightforward. Have a requirements expert apply rigor to the gathering of requirements using interviews, what we call job shadowing, following somebody around. Context diagrams are pictures that show how people interrelate with the system. We also have things like prototypes. But I think here really the solution is not necessarily those tools. The solution is in the phrase requirements expert. This is not, I would maintain that the business analysts are trained in this, maybe somewhat the project managers, but you want somebody who knows how to do this, knows how to do it well. And part of it, eliciting requirements, making sure they get exactly what the customer wants. That's the reason number 1 that came from the survey. Okay. Reason number 2, scope creep. This is a big one. Project scope is the sum total of all the work you're going to do and not do on the project. Okay, so it's everything you say. If we're going to ship this product, let's say it's a product, it could be a service too. We're going to ship in the United States, but not in the UK. Well, we have to say we're going to ship in the United States and not the UK. We have to say exactly what it is we're going to build. When the sponsor signs off, he or she has to say, I'm getting this, but I'm not getting that. So we need some mechanism. And a mechanism might be what we call a work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure is a picture of the work you're going to do, and I'll show you one in a minute. And this is best done in a meeting with the entire team. It serves at least 2 purposes: having a meeting of the minds on deliverables and also getting team buy-in. It's a wonderful way to do that. So that's a thought about the way you might do it. And there's one other thing about scope creep. I'll entertain or ask this question of the audience. In addition to prevent scope creep, I want to rigorously control my scope by creating a work breakdown structure, which I'll show you in a minute, which is a picture of my scope, and having a scope statement. Once that's in place, what ideas might you have for actually controlling that scope? Once it's in place, are there any ideas for actually controlling that scope? You can chat those ideas to me, if you have any. Hopefully you're not seeing, I'm not sure what you're seeing, but I'll put this over here. Okay? All right, one answer is, and I'll bring it up here, change control. Because what tends to happen in scope creep is once you've defined the scope and you've said exactly what you're going to do, what very often happens in a company is the customer or the sponsor or somebody runs upstairs or downstairs or whatever and says, stop the presses, we now need this instead of that. So even though you define the requirements in the scope, everybody stops what they're doing and they start doing the new thing. But the problem with scope creep is if you don't have a new schedule or a new budget or new risks, you're trying to do all the things you were doing plus more stuff in the same amount of time. That can't happen. If you have rigorous change control, that ends that procedure. That has to go through a change control board who says, we approve, and here's the new schedule, or we reject it, and there is no new schedule. So that work breakdown structure that I mentioned, let me bring that up here. I went back a bullet. Looks something like this. This is just a level 4. Very quickly, for sake of time, this is a website I worked on. The top level is 1.0. All the second level is design, content, test, hosting and production and development. All those 5 things make up the website. And then underneath design are some of the items: site research, collect URLs, design presentation, create storyboards. Each of the areas, design, content, test, hosting, and production development, are broken down to lower levels. And this will be your scope. How many levels? It really depends. There's no right or wrong answer to the number of levels. Usually it's bound by hours, 80 hours, 40 hours, a couple hundred hours. Once you have this picture up on the board, which is typically done with Post-it notes, you would then have a very good idea of your scope. And going back a step, you would control that scope by having a change control board. That's the answer to the scope creep problem. Third problem, resources. People are always overallocated. Everybody's working on 2 or maybe 3 projects at once at least, right? I know people who are working on more than that. And so the question becomes, how do you then control that? How do you control everybody working on everything at the same time? How do people know who's working on what? And some schedules, if you use something like Microsoft Project, it's not uncommon to see people schedule 24 hours per day because they just throw people's names in there. You have to level your resources and say, you know, Joe can work 6 hours a day, or better said, Joe can work 3 hours a day on this project and 4 hours a day on that project. And Mary can work 2 on this, but not on the other one, etc. So you first have to assign the people correctly to each of the projects, and then you have to make sure that there's a top-down view from management level. So in point of fact, a question for the audience, I did have one answer before. Does anybody have an idea? Wait, if you want to chat, response to me. Is there, over and above using a centralized resource software, which a lot of people don't have, is there a way to pool that information together? Any ideas on that? I'll just wait for a chat. Okay.
Yeah, folks, sorry, Jim, I'm interrupting. Folks, you can see there's a question panel on your computer screen. If you want to respond, you can just open this window and write your response on this question panel. And by default, everyone is muted, and this we have done intentionally so that there should not be any disturbance.
Fair enough. What I have open, Raj, is the chat panel, so that's why I can see it right now. So, okay, fair enough. So Let me get back to the presentation. And let's see here if I can get that back up. Let's try to bring my slide. There it is. One of the solutions here is very simple, a very low-tech thing. Use a spreadsheet. Get your project manager together in a room once a week, like Monday morning, and they say, you know, okay, the architect is going to be here from March 1st to April 31st, April 28th or something, and then there from May 1st to June 30th. So everybody knows where the people are. So that's one way to do it. So there's 2 solutions to this. One is to have upper level, even if it's project manager or senior management, looking at the resources across the board. And two is make sure the resources are allocated correctly across with the project. And here's an example of over-allocated resources in Microsoft. Using Microsoft Project as an example, everybody in red is over-allocated. Okay, we don't have the exact number of hours, but it means they're working more than 8 hours a day. We can't do that. It's a fictitious schedule at that point. Reason number 4, communications. I probably don't even have to belabor this. If you're familiar with the project management body of knowledge, that's the book that the Project Management Institute puts out that talks about best practices. They have an entire knowledge area just for communications. My personal contention, the average person is not a very good communicator. I didn't believe that 20 years ago. I had no opinion on it 20 years ago. But what happens is, over time, people just either don't answer their emails, which means, I guess, no, if they don't answer, or you write them an email and they answer half of the questions. They quickly answer it and move on. So you need to get team members trained in communications. And by that, I don't mean they need to go to a fancy 3-day class someplace and learn about all the methods. At the very least, you, if you're a project manager, should be teaching people how they're going to communicate on the project, whether it's by email and how to escalate that if that's not the case, or what method you're going to use. And that would be one idea to get people to communicate better. Is there anything anybody out there has ever created that would help in communication that you can think of? Anything anybody can think of that they might know of that they used as a way of governing communications? I have an idea in my head, and I'll reveal it in a second, but I wanted to see what you folks thought of anything. Let's see if I can, just looking to see if I can see the chat area there, Raj, but for some reason it's gone away. Let's see here. Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it back. All right. So an idea here is the communications management plan. This is a communications management plan. And this says, look at what happens here, who the stakeholder is, how we're going to communicate, how often, what type of communication, and what notes we have about it. So the sponsor is a stakeholder. PowerPoint weekly, give them a status update. The team gets an email weekly, status, action items. Meetings should be held face-to-face, we say. This is arbitrary, but in this situation we can. Often it's virtual. Senior management, PowerPoint, monthly, status and action items. And a steering committee. And it might be here, the steering committee is often used between phases to make sure we can go forward. This is just an idea of a communications management plan that says how we're expected to communicate. And, you know, it might say something like status reports will be in SharePoint every month or whatever. That's fine, as long as they know where to go to get that. But you yourself, as the project manager, have to be what I call the master communicator. Speaking of stakeholders, this is a big deal because these are people who have a vested interest in your project, not only for good or for ill. These people can help you or they can hurt you. And they're not out intentionally to hurt you. Well, they may be in some cases, but it may be that what your project is doing is inimical or the antithesis of what they want to do. You have to make sure you understand who they are, what power they have, what influence, and what their interests are. And you do this by getting in a room with your team. An overriding thing about this session is teamwork. Getting in a room with a team. Who are these people? Get your sponsor in a room, right? Get your sponsor in a room and say, hey, Mr. and Ms. Sponsor, who do you think is powerful on this project that can help or hurt us? Identify those people and find out how to communicate them. And that will be part of the communications plan, is to say these stakeholders will be communicated to by such and such a method every X amount of time, and engage them and make them aware of stuff. So we keep them informed before and during the project. And we use a power interest grid to find them. You might find this kind of interesting. It could be a power interest grid or a power support grid. Take a look at what's happening here in this picture. On the top right are the high interest, high power people. Key players, they get regular updates, they get monthly presentations. But on the bottom left are people who are less interested and less powerful. We keep them informed periodically. And the other two boxes can mirror each other as far as interest and power. As far as the words that are inside of each box, those are arbitrary. I made them up. But you would decide how you're going to communicate to these people once you identify their interests and their power and their support level. By the way, one of the reasons I mentioned involving the sponsor is for this reason. You might be tempted to put somebody in the keep informed periodically box. you figure that they're low interest, low power. But your sponsor might walk in and say, you know what, I'm going to tell you, Joe, to move this person up into the top right quadrant. You don't need to know the reasons why, or maybe he'll tell you the reasons why, but sometimes there's a very sensitive stakeholder and you need to treat them a little bit differently. Maybe something happened in the past that you're unaware of. So involving stakeholders is very, very, very important from the very beginning of the project in the initiating stage all the way through the end. Issue 7, or reason number 6, estimates. Estimating is much more art than science. This is both for cost and for time. Very often, there's only a couple of industries, like construction. Construction has a database of time it takes to build a building and a floor and install appliances, and the construction people use that as a basis of estimates. They may not take the exact numbers, but they use them as a starting point. And often mechanics have their estimates for doing a carburetor or whatever, but the rest of us, within software there's a thing called function points, but for the rest of us, it's really hard to make estimates. Is it 5 days? Is it 10 days? Is it 2 weeks? And it's even harder for the team. So the first thing that the team member should be doing the estimate, not you as the project manager. Theoretically, you're too far removed. Theoretically, you're too far removed from this. You probably are. I used to be an IT guy building servers and whatnot. I've been away from it for too long. I'm going to have some idea, but I'm going to trust the guy or gal doing it now. And then we keep historical data. They track their time, they track everything, and then the next project, they have something to base it on. And the question I would ask here, in fact, I won't even ask the question because I think I kind of probably got ahead of myself, historical data. The difficulty there is that your people may not want to track their time. It's difficult to get them to track their time. They're working on 2 or 3 projects, but ultimately it's worth it because if you have that historical database, when you go to projects 2 and 3, your estimates will be better. If your estimates are wildly off, and then you're buffering your estimates, and they're buffering estimates, and you're adding some buffer, there's no way to come up with, add that to the fact that people are over-allocated, and you've got a real mess of a schedule basically there. So you want to have a realistic schedule. Here's some estimating techniques. I already mentioned the historical. This is an interesting one. The second one is called PERT. It stands for Program Evaluation Review Technique, a little history. This was developed by the U.S. Navy back in the 50s. And they came up with an idea of estimates for things that are uncertain. The formula here is the person's optimistic guess, say it's 5 days, I'm making that up, plus 4 times the most likely, say it was 10 days, plus pessimistic, 15 days. And you would take those numbers and you would divide them by 6 data points. And they weight it towards the most likely. And now instead of the person just saying, giving you a 1 number, which is 7 days, she gives you 3 numbers in a range, and it accounts for the uncertainty in the estimate. It not only accounts for the uncertainty, it gives her a little bit of wiggle room of not having to land on one particular date. You can do the PERT estimate for all your activities on the project, or you can do them for the most risky ones. And secondly is the 3-point. Optimistic plus most likely plus pessimistic divided by 3. You'll know it doesn't weight it towards the most likely, and it's a simple average. So either one. The PERT is very easy to do. Either one of them is very, very easy to do. And in fact, PERT estimate was used in Microsoft Project right through version 2007. They dropped it. I don't know why. Maybe it wasn't popular, but it was in there. Or you might just have 2 points, best case or worst case estimate. You have to determine what works in your environment. This isn't one size fits all. If you have a 1,000-line schedule, you're not going to get 1,000 PERT estimates, but you might get the most risky ones. And you're getting people to think. Is what's happening. You're getting people to think about their real estimates. That's the important thing. Reason 7, risk. I could talk all day about risk, but I don't have that kind of time. People don't know what their risks are. They don't know how to do risk management. They don't think about the fact that there is so much uncertainty in the project. And there is, if you think about it. Remember all the things we just said? Uncertainty of the estimates, uncertainty of the overallocation, uncertainty of the end date. All that's uncertain to you. You just don't know from project to project, even if you've done a similar project over and over again. So the problem here is you need to learn how to identify risks, prioritize those risks, come up with thresholds for the most important risks. And if you identify, I'm just saying, let's say you identify 50 risks. Of those, maybe 5 of those are the top 5, and you worry about those the most. You spend your time mitigating those or avoiding those, wherever the case may be. You don't ignore the other 45. You monitor them. But if you've identified the top 5, 6, 7, Now you've got something you can say, if this thing happens, here's my contingency. The problem, of course, in bullet 3 is there's a bit of a sales job for your risk management to senior management because you're spending money and doing things in advance for something that may never happen. Risk is a crystal ball. It may happen. It may not happen. So you're saying to your boss, please spend money to prevent something from happening that may not happen. So there's a bit of a sales job on your part to make that happen. And I think a solution there is that if you have a hard time convincing senior management, do it on a smaller, less impactful project to see its benefits. You have to study up a little bit on this. This is by no means a risk management course. You have to learn how to identify risks and prioritize them and whatnot, but it's probably an afternoon's worth of training, and then you get good at it and you can start doing it and see the benefits of it, because I personally will not work on a project without three things. Work breakdown structure, which I showed you earlier, a risk plan, which we're talking about here, and also with change control. I think those three things are vitally important to have. By the way, this you're looking at on this screen is called a probability impact matrix. This is the way you analyze risk. On the bottom is the impact. Now these numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, won't mean anything to you, but they've been pre-assigned meanings within the organization. 2 might be low impact, 10 is obviously high impact, so you can see that. And on the y-axis is probability. What happens is the team determines the impact should a risk happen, and the team determines the probability of its happening. And you tend to multiply the impact times the probability, and then you get scores. Look up here in the red. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are in red. Those are the highest score. The yellow ones are the next, and the green are the lowest. So now I've taken 25 risks that I've identified, and this will be on a Post-it note on a flip chart, and I've decided that these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 risks are the highest. Those are the ones where I'll spend most of my time and money. And by the way, that one in the upper right quadrant, watch out for that. That could be urgent. That could be a risk you've identified that's so urgent you've got to go to your sponsor and say, geez, we've identified this very risky thing. We need to take immediate action. So bottom line here is, no matter how many risks you identify, you're going to want to prioritize and scoring them. And it's always probability times impact. Remember that. That's the key. What's the probability? What's the impact? The probability is what it is. The impact is a scale you devise in-house. And the question you're probably asking is, isn't this subjective? Yes, it is. It's very subjective. But I'll tell you what. If you're on my team and you're the expert on, if I'm manufacturing and I need parts and you're the expert on parts, I'm going to ask you the probability and impact in your head of parts being late, for example. Or if I'm importing parts and I'm worried about a dock strike, I'm going to expect you, my expert on import-export, to go down to the dock or read the Wall Street Journal or whatever and tell me what the probability impact is. That's much better than the man on the street or the woman on the street. I am using expert opinion. And by the way, if I don't have those experts on my team, I'll hire a consultant who's expert in those areas. I must analyze my risk and know when it's high and low. Really vital. Here are your responses. Once you've identified risk, I'm going to give you a very quick summary of these. You have 4 options. There's some for positive risk. We'll talk about negative risk. Avoid it. If you know that something is going to happen that's going to cause the risk and it's going to be negative, if it can be avoided, then you try to avoid it. For example, let's say that you're planning on using your software version 2.0 to go to a trade show. And a trade show is 3 months away, and somebody in your lab says version 2.0 is buggy right now. But if we go back to version 1X, he says to me, we'll get some of the functionality for the trade show, but not all of it. I might go to my sponsor and say, Mr. Sponsor, you and I are working a trade show in 3 months. I can't give you version 2.0 without throwing a lot of bodies at it, but I can go back to version 1X and give you some of the functionality. He says, may say, you know, that's fine. Maybe he won't, but at least it's an option. Key word here is it's an option. I avoid the problem, and you're probably going to say, well, don't I eventually use version 2.0? Yes. But for now, I'm avoiding the problem. Later on, I'll factor it back in, you see. But I avoid it by driving the probability of it happening to 0. In a transfer, this is third-party insuring. A very simple example is when you drive your car, you insure your car, and if you total it, the insurance company pays for the car. That's cost risk being transferred. I subcontract. I have performance bonds where somebody, if he doesn't do a good job, and he pays a fine. So I'm transferring cost risk, and I often do this via contracts. I'm going to skip mitigate for a second and come back to it. Accept is do nothing. Accept basically says it's so low of a risk. I'm going to go back here for a second. Let's go back here. See the bottom left here? The green, the 20, and the 2. It's such a low risk I accept it. If it happens, it happens. So because I can't prevent against all of them. I don't have the time or money, and I don't care about it so much. If it was a personnel issue, if the architect quits the project, I care a lot. If a clerk quits, oh well, minor blip. The third bullet here is mitigate. I might reduce the probability of a risk happening by taking proactive steps. So if I had hired a contractor, that would be a transfer. But if I was afraid the contractor might leave before his 6 months is up, what do you think I might do? Let me throw that question out there, see if I can get a chat on this. If you were going to hire a contractor and he was supposed to stay for 6 months, but you didn't know if he would stay, but you really needed him because he was key to the project, how can you mitigate the probability of him leaving? Is there anything you can do? Probably a couple things. I'll reveal them. I'm just going off the cuff here. I don't have this written down. What would you do if you had a contractor for 6 months and you wanted to better ensure that he'll stay? Any ideas? Give me one idea.
Well, Jim, I can see that there's a response from Rich Wheeler,
Yep.
which is saying bonus for completing the contract. And
Yes.
Jerome is saying put it in his contract.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. A good idea. I'm glad you can see that. I wasn't able to see that. So clearly, and that's a mitigation. Why is it a mitigation? Because you're doing something proactive to drive down the probability of him leaving, you see. So the first part is reduce the probability. You give him a bonus at the end or even at milestones along the way, and you reduce the probability. Maybe the probability was 80% and you're driven it to 30% because you've redone your probability impact matrix. But you still have some impact of probability. Do you not? You still have 30% probability. So you have to figure out what are you going to do to reduce the impact if it still occurs. Well, one thing you might do is hire somebody to shadow him. So now you have a three-factor response. First factor is you hire a subcontractor, which is a transfer. Second factor, you reduce the probability of him leaving by promising him a completion bonus. But if he still leaves despite the completion bonus, you've hired somebody to shadow him to learn what he knows in case he leaves. Now you might say, why not avoid it by not hiring that guy in the first place? That's perfectly valid. That's perfectly valid. I'm just using that as an example of how you might mitigate something, but you might avoid it. And those are your combinations of things you can do to deal with risk. And you thought it out proactively before the project even starts. Unsupported project culture is reason number 8. The problem is many people don't even know what a project management is or what a project manager does. This is corporation-wide in an organization. I see this all the time. There's a great lack of knowledge at the senior level of what an accountant does or what a lawyer does or an electrician does. When it comes to project management, it's sort of vague and fuzzy. So what happens is they say, well, anybody can do project management, and they hand it off to somebody who isn't equipped. And then when the project fails, they say, well, it must be the failure of project management. And I say, well, no, maybe you handed it off to the wrong person, or you didn't train the person. Maybe the secretary wants to be a project manager. You can take him or her and train them and do that and give them the proper tools. So we have what I call an unsupported project culture in that respect. And it's not uncommon. And the solution here is education, especially at the senior management level. The accidental project manager, this is very related to the previous one. In this case, I saw this a lot when I worked in pharmaceutical. You would have, there was a guy I worked with, I actually had to go overseas to mentor him. He was a very good biochemist. And so the logic was as follows. If he's a good biochemist, therefore he'll be a good project manager. Well, that didn't necessarily make any sense. Sure, he could think logically, but that wasn't the point. The point was they took him from a biochemist role, made him a project manager. He didn't have any leadership skills, for one thing, and he certainly didn't know how to do a schedule. So he was failing. He's actually succeeded over time, but there was a long period. So accidental project manager is that person promoted in one field, or done well in one field, promote to project manager, but he doesn't have the support system or the training in place. I applaud people from other disciplines coming in. What I don't applaud is the lack of training in that. So again, the answer here is education of both senior management and the project manager. There's no way around that. There's no other solution of letting them know what the main problem is, and that goes back to the unsupported project culture. Almost down to the last one, monitoring and controlling. This is something a lot of people don't know of. They do it in their projects, but they don't call it this. Monitoring and controlling is all about setting a baseline for your project, looking for variance, taking corrective action. Let me tell you in a nutshell what monitoring and controlling is. You have a baseline, which is what you agree to do, whether it's a schedule or your budget or your scope, all the stakeholders agree. And then as you run the project, you monitor the variance. What did we plan? What did we actually accomplish? Measure the variance, excuse me, and take corrective action. I'll repeat that. You take the plan. As the project runs, you compare against the actual, you look at the variance, and you take some corrective action. Whatever that may be, redoing the schedule, recording actuals, letting people go, hiring people, bringing the schedule in. And the other part of this is the doneness. How do you know how done you are? How do you know if you're 90% done? I see this all the time on projects. Every week, the team member is 90% done or 50% done. What does that mean? Is he 5 out of 10 weeks done? Is he $5,000 out of $10,000 done? What does it mean? So the problem is you have to figure out what done really means. What does complete mean? If you're building a wall, it's pretty easy. In some cases, it's hard to know if you're doing software what doneness means. So you have to figure out a way to figure out what doneness is. And very often people will do this by figuring out something like milestones. I don't have a slide on this particular thing, but they'll figure out milestones and they'll say, you know, when we are X% done, that's one milestone, he's 25% done. Y% done, second milestone, we're done. So you have to actually figure out what done means and measure it according to that. And you can't just guess it. Or the worst thing you can do is ask the team member what % done he is. It's the worst because he has no idea. And he's always going to come up with some high number. You have to figure out what doneness means for everything. That's what monitoring and controlling is all about. And you have to record your actuals in the schedule. If you're not doing that, all the numbers you report to management are false. Now, there's one other thing, which I'm near the end here, with bonus reason. This is the one I mentioned very early up front. Fixing the wrong problem. Managers, when realizing their projects are out of control, reach for a quick fix. Then they send people for certification or training, and it's good to have certification. I teach it. I like it. And they think that if they teach, then somehow people will then come up raise the bar of the organization. The problem is, and I've seen this over and over again, they teach the people, but then the people come back into the organization, but then the organization doesn't support what they just learned. So now these people will become more mature project managers, but the organization isn't more mature. Very quick example, a colleague of mine from California called me and he said, this is a very seasoned guy. He's not a project manager, he's more of a requirements guy. And he said, can you help me outline a advanced scheduling class? I said, well, what do you mean by advanced? And we talked for about 45 minutes. It became very clear that he didn't need an advanced scheduling class for his customers. What they needed to do was understand the basics better. They didn't get the basics right, how to schedule, how to avoid risk, all these things. So rather than have an advanced scheduling class, they thought they knew how to do everything because they've been doing it for 10 years, but they've been doing a lot of things wrong for 10 years. So the fix there was somewhat in training, but secondarily, in training the right thing, right, fix the right problem, and then go back in the organization and make sure they support it. Because as I said to him, even if you train these people in the basics and they go back in the organization doesn't support it, then it's a waste of time. So you have to fix the right problem. Training solves some things, but very often it's the culture that's broken and not the fact that people aren't well trained, or it might be a combination of those two things. So that's bonus reason number 11, like I said, which is always fix the right problem, or do your root cause analysis. And your actions going forward. Here's my favorite proverb lately: a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. A lot of people, on hearing me give the kind of talk, say, I can't do all that. And my response is as follows: nobody's asking you to do all that. What you need to do is take small steps. You just figure out which of the things I've talked about, if they've added some value, you might say, I'm going to go back and do risk management. I'm going to research this work breakdown structure. I'm going to do change control. Pick one thing. Pick two things. And you can go to your boss and say, I want to improve process in the organization. If they're open to that, hopefully they are. When I did it before, I introduced change management into the company with it over a period of 2 quarters. And if it wasn't 2 quarters, it would be 3 quarters. Because it's going to take a while to make these changes. You have cultural impact and you have resistance. So take it, baby steps like that, and then you can get to the end and you can make it happen. So that's number one piece of advice I can give you. Don't try to, as we say, boil the ocean. Don't try to do everything at once. Try to pick something that will have some impact, do it on a pilot project, let it grow, see the results, and you can bring some of this forward. And I'm not advocating that you will have a nirvana in your organization, but it'll certainly be better. At least you'll solve some of those problems. And again, these being the top 10 or 11, boy, if you could solve or come a long way to solving these, you'd be well ahead of the game. And that's pretty much it. So if anybody has any questions or chats for me, I'm open to it. I can see the chat window, Raj, but I can't see the question window. So if you have them there, I'll certainly take them.
Yeah, folks, if you have any question, please feel free to write your question in the question panel. Yeah, I can see the first question from Rich Wheeler. Do you have a breakdown of how often each cause contributes to project failure?
No, and I don't know that anybody does, Rich, or for the general audience. I have never seen. That's almost impossible. Let me answer that in two ways. It's impossible, if not very, very difficult to quantify. Secondly, nobody really takes the time. You'll be astonished at the paucity or dearth of real statistics in project management. It's a miracle that the people that do these surveys can get them. So it's hard to say that requirements are more often, but I will say this. I can't say it's 10% of this or 20% of that, but I will say those top 5 that I showed you are probably eat up most of it, the requirements, scope, resources. If you worked on those and took it from that point of view, those are the highest. I say requirements, scope. What else do we have? Resources. I'm just looking through this. Communications and stakeholder management. Those are the ones that I see, but I can't give you exact percentages. I don't have those numbers. I don't know that anybody does.
All right. So, folks, if you still have any questions, please feel free to ask your question. Okay, so Jim, I can see like there are no more questions. Yeah, I got one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
How does lack of stakeholder management contribute to failure?
Oh, good question. I'll tell you, let me give you a couple stories about this. Stakeholder management, I'll give you a personal story and then another non-personal story. I went to New York for a while to do a project for an investment bank. And I was told when I got there, the project was to roll out PCs to the various trading floors, which you can imagine is a big deal. You can't have any downtime. A trading floor costs you thousands of dollars an hour when you're down. I was told the 2 stakeholders were in this one place in New Jersey I had to go to, were the manager of that site and his subordinate. I'll make a long story short. First of all, when we got to the site to do the actual rollout of the PCs, the technician, his subordinate, had done it. We said, well, you didn't do it right. And we found out later the reason he had done it was he saw us as a threat to him. So basically we had a hostile stakeholder, somebody who thought that we were there to somehow put him out of a job, which is really not the case. Our job was to support him and help him do that. Problem number one. When I went back and talked to my boss and I told him this problem, I figured, well, that would solve it. And this guy came in and alerted a bunch of people above him, and people started calling me and saying, well, I'm the manager of my boss's boss's boss. There were like 5 stakeholders involved in this one site that I didn't know about. Not my bad, right? I wish I had identified them, but I didn't. It's a long time ago, but I did that. So these stakeholders came in and basically were blaming me for not engaging them. And I could see their point, too. I should have had all my things in a row there. So if I had met all these stakeholders, and they would have known when I was coming in, not only would they have been able to be apprised of it and be aware of it, but that guy couldn't have pulled his act and done what he did because they would have been aware that I was supposed to come in. And a very quick story, not from my experience, if you're ever curious, read the case study from the Denver International Airport. It's up on the internet, Denver International Airport. Now it was a fiasco back in the 90s. It's a great airport now, but for a long time it wasn't. Some of you may remember why. There are a number of reasons. Number one problem was technical complexity. Number one problem, the guy running it was not a project manager. But somewhere around there, reason number 4, number 5, was hostile stakeholder again. The airline, one of the airlines there, was actually opposed to the new airport. So they did wherever they could to stop it. So the reason stakeholder management is so important is because for the 2 reasons I just got done saying it, and even more, you need to buy people in. First of all, they may not want what you want. Number one, what you're excited about, they may hate for reasons of their own. And 2, even if they like it, you need to keep them engaged and make sure that they're on your side, and you need to keep them up to date with things that are happening. No surprises. Think of yourself as a stakeholder. And if somebody encroached upon what you're doing, how much would you like it? And think of it even greater if it were a project that affected a town, like a wastewater treatment plant. 100 years ago, you could build whatever you wanted, wherever you want. Now there's a town, there's a community group, etc., and everybody's involved. There's environmental people. So think about it from that point of view. And if you don't manage that group, they will just roll over you, basically, is what's going to happen. This is so important that in the project management body of knowledge, the PMI book, a year ago when they came out with the new one, they took stakeholder management out of the communications area and gave it an area of its own. So it's vastly important. It's huge, absolutely huge. Now, some of you may know your stakeholders, and you know them the same every time. But a lot of you are going to go from project to project to project and have new stakeholders. That's where it becomes really key.
Yeah, there is one more question. How technical do you have to be to mitigate risk in software development project, or does the team comes up with the risks?
Oh, well, good question. If you're a project, if I understand the question correctly, if you're a project manager and you're not particularly technical, you may have other problems, which is being able to communicate. That's one problem. But the other one is the team coming up with the risk. So what you're doing, you're sitting in a room, you're laying the project out. Everybody knows what the project is. You have what we call your artifacts. You have your work breakdown structure you've created. You have your scope statement. And then you say to the team, say there's 10 or 20 people, whatever the number of people is, okay, here's a handoff we have. What's the risk in that? And somebody says, well, the last time we did that, this happened. And then the floodgates open, or the senior developer says, well, the last time, we haven't written this particular code before. We wrote code before for a previous project, but we haven't written in this particular language, or whatever the case may be, and the risk is X. So I don't think it's so much a matter for risk management that you be the subject matter expert. That's their job. Okay, that's their job. They're going to break that down for you. The larger problem you have when you're not technical, and I'll speak from my own experience again. I told you that I was in pharmaceutical for 9 years. I have no pharmaceutical background whatsoever. The reason I was in pharmaceutical, I was brought in as a consultant, and I was teamed with subject matter experts. But the problem I had, if you ever worked in a pharmaceutical environment, I didn't know what they were talking about. So I had to have a lot of that interpreted to me. A lot of it was it's like completely like a foreign language. So it was difficult for me to interpret all the time what they were saying, and even know when they were pulling the wool over my eyes. If they said something took 5 weeks, I wouldn't know if it took 5 weeks or 5 years. So the problems in managing a team of technical people when you yourself are not technical aren't necessarily just in the risk, but they're across the board of being able to talk to these people and understand what they're saying and interpret what they're saying. But I think at the end of the day, if they're understanding that you're a good project manager and you've got a good subject matter expert working, it's up to them to identify the risk. You know, it's up to you. It's up to you to push. It's up to you to push them and say, have you really thought about the risk involved in that? It's up to you to pull it out of them, the best out of them. I think that's your real job there.
All right, so folks, I can see there are no more questions now.